And welcome back to the Afrolit Digital Den. We are now getting ready to go into the second part of the introduction. And as you are listening to me read and as you are reading along, I'd like you to think of some questions as we are reading. So, what is the main argument or thesis of the essay? How does the author support his argument? Are there any counter arguments presented in the essay? If so, how does the author address them? What evidence or examples does the author use to strengthen his points? Does the essay contribute to the broader conversation or understanding of the topic? In this case, we're looking at decolonizing the African mind. And are there any limitations or potential areas of further exploration that the essay raises? So these questions will help you engage critically and deepen your understanding of its content. So in this segment, we are in part 2 of the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to read this out loud. I know you guys are good readers, but sometimes it's good to be able to see it and read along with someone to really hash out these deep ideas. So here we go. In decolonizing the African mind, as distinct from the third world mind, certain particulars of African history need to be taken into account. All right, so we have the African mind and making that distinct from the third world mind. So we have two sets of mind forms here. Now, he says the most important is that for the past 13 centuries, Africa has been invaded, conquered, and colonized by Arabs and Europeans. Their cultural assimilation programs, which continue till this day, have burdened Africa and with Arabized and Europeanized aerials. Okay, so here we have these faithful aerials who either function as an Arab or function as a European. Severed from his ancestral traditions and alienated from his natural African identity, the Arabized African strives to be even more Arab than his Arab master, and the Europeanized African strives to be even more European than his European master. And that is so true. Like Uthman Biri ibn Idris, a 14th century king of Borno, the Arabized African declares himself an Arab on the basis of his Arabized culture or of a fictitious genealogy, linking himself to some Arab ancestor, preferably to some alleged member of the Prophet Muhammad's tribe of the Quraysh. Now, guys, please pardon me if I'm botching these words. This is new reading to me, so I'm learning just as well as you are. So please forgive me if I'm really not pronouncing these words correctly. The Europeanized African, like the late Kofi Busia, one-time Prime Minister of Ghana, declares himself a European because of his European education and culture. Fanon's famous phrase, black skin, white mask, applies to both kinds of African aerial. Both believe in the intrinsic superiority. So both believe, so we have the Arabized African and the Europeanized African. So both believe in the intrinsic superiority of the white invaders of Africa. Each proselytizes for the culture of his Prospero. Let's see. is hostile to decolonization and is contemptuous of any re Africanization of African culture. Interesting. Okay, so let's see here. We go to the next page. Believing that Arabs are Allah's chosen people, the Arabized African does not find it anal- anomalous that there are so many Arab republics on African soil. He is not moved to ask, how did they come into existence? What does their presence mean? Why are their numbers increasing? Huh, these are great questions here. I'm going to highlight these question marks. This is what I teach my students because these are questions that the author is posing for us to critique. If anything, he views them as a matter for rejoicing. Obviously, he can't well resist Arab imperialism if he believes that Arabs are God's chosen mediators between man and God, or that Arabic, one of the major colonial languages in Africa, is the language of God himself. Any invitation to de Arabize his culture would be viewed as sacrilegious, as an invitation to opt to spend eternity in hell. Ooh, okay, so that whole section right there dealt with the Arabized African. So it looks like the next section is going to delve into the Europeanized African. So the Europeanized African, for his part, is overwhelmed by the fantastic achievements of industrial civilization, especially if you're in the US, right? But having accepted the European propaganda that industrial civilization is the genetic property of its European pioneers, he fails to distinguish industrial civilization as a type from modern European civilization as an instance of the type. Okay, that was deep. So let's see. But having accepted the European propaganda, okay, so here we have propaganda, which is very important. Okay, so this is a part of the conditioning, right? So having accepted the European propaganda that industrial civilization, okay, so here we have this technological civilization, industrial civilization, is the genetic property of its European pioneers. So in a sense, we believe that it's a part of their genes. They are technical masters and geniuses. And he fails to distinguish industrial civilization as a type from modern European civilization as an instance of the type. So that's just an instance, one part in time of that type. His desire for the former is therefore perverted into a wish to assimilate himself into the latter. So, because we admire the industrialist civilization, so let me make sure I said that right. We admire the industrial civilization, we connect it to modern European civilization, but they're two different things. Interesting. So he overlooks the fact, which the Japanese and the Chinese have demonstrated, that industrial civilization can be replicated by non Europeans. And he is usually ignorant of the fact that Europeans were latecomers to scientific culture and that their pioneering of the Industrial Revolution was based on the scientific heritage they borrowed from others, including the ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations. Obviously, he can't resist European imperialism if he believes that Europeans are the sole owners of the paradise of industrial civilization, or that European languages, which are colonial languages in Africa, are indispensable for participation in industrial civilization. Now, that was me. I believe that. I believe that, especially English. I believe that English was the language of commerce, right? It's the lingua franca of many international um, alliances and coalitions and all that good stuff. So I'm thinking, yeah, the European language, English, is indispensable for participation in the industrial civilization. Like, if you want to stay cutting edge, you have to know English, you have to know French, all these European languages. But Chinweizu just told us that the Chinese and the Japanese have proved to us that no, Europeans are not the industrial civilization that we crave to be a part of. So any invitation to de Europeanize his culture would be viewed as an invitation away from the industrial paradise and back to some pre industrial hell, right? Maybe back to some primitive state that they always want to say that Africans came from. Such veneration of alien cultures leaves the African Ariel susceptible to foreign domination. It makes him eager for approval and acclaim by Arab and European imperialists. He wants to write and read literature approved by these imperialists. He wants to contest in those sports that these imperialists organize and dominate. He wants to embark on the subservient economic development which these imperialists promote. He wants to accept the identity of these imperialists fashion for him. Wow. He wants to accept the identity which these imperialists fashion for him. And Amos Wilson always talked about that. The dominators shape our personalities, shape our wants and our tastes and our interests. And so here, he wants to accept the identity which these imperialists fashion for him. He is eager to abandon his ancestral religions for those concocted and dispensed by these imperialists. He wants to hear only the version of his history which these imperialists peddle. He is eager to join the commonwealths which these imperialists sponsor. If the African Ariel has his way, African countries would join or perpetually remain in the Arab Commonwealth, known as the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the British Commonwealth, the French Community, and the Comecon, Comecon, of the Russians. Yet these are only thinly disguised continuations today of the old Arab, British, French, and Russian empires. The historic mission of present day Africans is to effect a renaissance of African civilization in an industrial mode so that Africa can henceforth defend itself against all invaders. Let's highlight that. So, this is part of our mission here. So let me get my pen here and star that. All right. So the historic mission of present day Africans is to effect a renaissance of African civilization in an industrial mode so that Africa can henceforth defend itself against all invaders. This is Afrofuturism. In this connection, the African Ariel's commitment to alien religions has curious consequences for his defense of Africa. It was recently proclaimed that the Nigerian army recognized only two religions, Christianity and Islam. This means that religions which were founded by Jews and Arabs and which were imported into Nigeria are the only ones recognized in the army of the leading nation of the Black world. Their shrines in Mecca, Rome, and Jerusalem are sacred to the Nigerian state, which helps fund pilgrimages to them. But shrines at Ife, Benin, Calabar, etc., which belong to religions founded by the ancestors of Nigerians, are given no place in the rights of the Nigerian state. Thus, if Nigeria ever went to war against invading Jews or Arabs, as might well happen given Nigerian passions over the Arab Israel conflict, patriotic Nigerians would march out praying to Jehovah of the Jews and Allah of the Arabs to help them vanquish these invaders. But what God would desert his chosen people and side with outsiders against them? A sorry fix Nigerians would then find themselves in for relying on the gods of others. Mm. As that example shows, our historic mission demands a re Africanization of the African, even in such matters as his religion. But at the core of its demands is a restoration of the African cultural personality, and a version consistent with an industrial economy. Okay, that's very important there. So here, so we have our mission, what we need to do, what we need to be working on, re-Africanization of the African, even in matters of religion. But then he says, at its core, but at the core of its demands is a restoration of the African cultural personality. So we have to get ourselves back. We need our cultural personality in a version consistent with an industrial economy. So we can still maintain our technological advances, um, maintain, all the cutting edge, innovative technological pieces. We don't have to go backwards, but we do need to have our own African cultural personality. So, doing that requires that Africans exercise an independent cultural initiative. Decolonizing the African mind, freeing it from alien control, is a necessary condition for such initiative. The reason is simple. The colonized mind, like a well conditioned slave, is incapable of initiative independent of its master. Initiative in pursuit of the slave's own interests would be tantamount to revolt. Given his conditioning, all his master need to do is in his revolt. So all his master need do to end his revolt is to speak in tones that trigger his deeply ingrained habit of obedience. Ending his habit of submission to his master's voice, destroying his master's authority over him, become necessary if that slave is to do things in his own interests. A renaissance of African civilization in an industrial mode is not in the interest of Africa's Arab and European enemies. That is correct. We got to highlight that. They're not interested in that. Okay, so a renaissance of African civilization in an industrial mode is not in the interest of Africa's Arab and European enemies. So long as they have any authority over what Africans do, they will assuredly use it to sabotage such a renaissance. And we've seen it time and time again. So the central objective in decolonizing the African mind is to overthrow the authority which alien traditions exercise over the African. This demands the dismantling of white supremacist beliefs and the structures which uphold them in every area of African life. And it's amazing how all of these institutions built on these beliefs are like saturated in our society. Okay, so the central objective in decolonizing the African mind is to overthrow the authority which alien traditions exercise over the African. This demands the dismantling of white supremacist beliefs and the structures which uphold them in every area of African life. It must be stressed, however, that decolonization does not mean ignorance of foreign traditions. It simply means denial of their authority and withdrawal of allegiance from them. So that is how he is defining it. Decolonization does not mean ignorance of foreign traditions. Okay, so we're not going to be ignorant of the Arabs' traditions or the Europeans' traditions, but it means that we're going to deny their authority. You have these traditions, it does not mean it has authority over me, right? So, denial of their authority and withdrawal of allegiance from them. I'm not pledging myself to the European God anymore. Foreign traditions are part of the harvest of human experience. One should certainly know about them, if only because one must know one's environment and especially one's enemy. One should certainly use items from other traditions provided they are consistent with African cultural independence and serve African objectives. But one should neither ape nor revere them, let alone sacrifice the African interests to them. Okay, so these are some rules here, right? So we should certainly know about them, if only because one must know one's environment, especially your enemy, right? One should certainly use items from other traditions provided they are consistent with African cultural independence. So we can certainly tap into some of these alien, what is he calling them? Let's see here. Ignorance of foreign traditions. So we certainly can use whatever traditions that are applicable and consistent with African cultural independence and serve African objectives. All right, so if the alien traditions do that, then we can continue to incorporate them. But one should neither ape nor revere them. Okay, so I am going to look up this word ape because I have one meaning, but I need to know the meaning of ape here. Okay, the strategic importance of overthrowing the authority of alien traditions lies in this. A renaissance of African civilization in an industrial mode implies a far reaching renovation of African cultures. Okay, so here we have this name here. Renovation calls for selectivity guided by the new objectives. Okay, so when you are renovating, okay, such as renovating a house, right? Renovation calls for selectivity. So now you got to be selective of what's being renovated. How is it going to be renovated? Guided by new objectives. Okay, so in doing this renovation, what is the goal? What is the end outcome, right? So renovation calls for selectivity guided by new objectives, like a plank, brick, or tile being used to renovate a house. Every cultural item for use in renovating African civilization has to be critically appraised to see if it meets the specifications demanded by the new objectives. Excuse me, so to see if it meets the specifications demanded by the new objectives. So as we are renovating ourselves, kind of like what China did, I wish we could shut our borders and just go in and renovate, right? But we're scattered. So we have to do this through unique methods, and technology can really help us with that. Okay, so here, every cultural item for use in renovating African civilization has to be critically appraised to see if it meets the specifications demanded by the new objectives. So elements from African tradition, no less than elements from non-African traditions, have to be thus appraised. But such appraisal would be impaired if not entirely prevented, if a tradition exercises an intimidating authority over Africans, as is now, alas, the case with the Arab and European traditions. So that we have been so conditioned by them that it will be kind of difficult to appraise these traditions here. So, overthrowing the authority of alien traditions will allow for the questioning of their contents, for selection of what is useful, for adapting to African conditions and needs, whatever is selected as useful. It will prevent the unexamined importation of the harmful as well as the unexamined importation of that for which equivalent or even superior African counterparts exist. If a foreign technique or principle in law, medicine, politics, economics, architecture, etc., has its analog in the African tradition, there's no reason not to keep the African item, provided both are of equal benefit. And even if they are not, the foreign item would be selectable only if the African item cannot be adopted to do the job. Otherwise, we will clutter our culture with unnecessary borrowings. It ought to be stressed that Europeanization and Arabization are at best superfluous to the creation of an industrial version of African civilization. We need to remind ourselves that the Japanese and Chinese have not repudiated their civilizations and did not abandon their identities when they set out to industrialize. The notion that industrialization of a society demands Europeanization of its culture, whether in the American, Russian, or other version, is a piece of imperialist propaganda. The cultures of the industrial societies differ profoundly from one another. What each has done is to take its pre industrial culture and place it on an industrial foundation. In the process, each has had to extensively renovate its culture to install the scientific ethos and to satisfy conditions necessary for industrialism. Africa's pre industrial cultures can equally expect to be profoundly altered by the demands of an industrial foundation. Such changes should not be confused with Europeanization just because they were first manifested during the industrialization of Europe. And I like to put a caveat there because remember, a lot was stolen through patents and trademarks. And so enslaved people did not have access to patent their ideas. So a lot of what happened during industrialization was stolen knowledge. Now, if a case cannot even be made for Africa to Europeanize its culture, if Europeanization is, at best, a pointless distortion, Arabization would be pure retrogression, a flight into archaic feudalism with an anti industrial mentality. We must soberly ask ourselves, has Arabic culture enabled the Arabs to achieve an industrial society? Okay, let's highlight that question mark there. Have they been able to defeat the industrialized Israelis, whom they outnumber some 75 to 1? If they have not, why would any sane African want to copy their impotent culture? Wow, I never heard it put that way. Interesting, because it would be retrogression, right? Not progress, but retrogress. Interesting. Of course, the Arabs could claim to hold the keys to the Arab heaven. Africans should then emulate the moribund Arab culture if death with entry into an Arab controlled hereafter is their aim, rather than survival and prosperity in the here and now. Interesting. According to Fanon, with the withdrawal of the colonial masters, the country finds itself in the hands of new managers. But the fact is that everything needs to be reformed and every thought out anew. And everything thought out anew. So the Ariels cannot see beyond merely managing their colonial inheritance. Indeed, they see it as against their interest to do anything else. But the Calibans know with Fanon that the task is not to manage the colonial inheritance, but to reform everything, to think everything out anew. The task is to define our own objectives, set our own standards, and pick our own heroes from among those who outstandingly serve our own interest. I need to highlight that because this is our task here, right? So this is our homework. All right. So clearly, those Ariels who are Arabizing or Europeanizing Africa must be defeated if Africa is to be free from concentrate. If Africa is to be free to concentrate on its historic tasks, a battle must be waged against them by the African Calibans, the inheritors of the movement for political decolonization. And I would argue not just political decolonization, but cultural decolonization, economic decolonization, informational decolonization, all of the above. So the battle is against Ariels among our artists and critics who pine for Prospero's praise. It is against Ariels who parrot Prospero's version of our history. Prospero's version of our history, right? Wow. Because Prospero is a revisionist. So he or she will tweak history to fit a claim or an argument in order to maintain oppression and repression. Because remember, as stated earlier, they are not interested in our Renaissance. It is against economic and political Ariels who would keep us subservient to Prospero's economic and political systems. So these are today's equivalents of the old slaving elites who destroyed Africa while hunting slaves for sale to Arabs and Europeans. Decolonizing the African mind may alternatively be seen as a battle between the Caliban and Ariel tendencies within each African, for bits of Ariel and Caliban exist within each of us. That's the double consciousness, right? Interesting. No African living in the 20th century has escaped the taint of the colonial experience. None has freed himself from the colonial mentality in every department or from the structures which maintain and reproduce that mentality. Yes, structures being schools. The decolonization of the African mind must therefore be seen as a collective enterprise, as a communal exorcism. Through an intellectual bath in which we need one another's help to scrub those nooks off our minds which we cannot scour by ourselves. So this speaks to the need for collectivism. We need to come together. We need to come together. All right, so that was just the introduction. Wow. So I'm really excited to check out part 1. economics. And so we will see what he has to say about economics. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching.